it's that time again, time for June Patreon birthday shoutouts. And I want to send a very happy birthday to Sarah, Michaela, Jennifer, Robin, Susan, Anne-Marie, and Gabrielle. Thank you so much for supporting Crime Lines over on Patreon. I appreciate all the support I get, and I hope these birthday shoutouts and the ad-free episodes and the bonus episodes and all of that is a sufficient way to show my appreciation for you. I hope you eat a lot of cake and maybe even some ice cream, and I just wanted to say happy birthday. A stranger carrying flowers rang a doorbell in an upscale Atlanta neighborhood and carried out a murder for hire. Though the police identified their prime suspect on day one, it would take nearly 20 years for justice. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. This is going to come out right as I get back from my big trip, but I'm recording it before I go, so I can't tell you how amazing London, Paris, and Bruges were just yet. But that's probably a good thing because as I look at my notes, this is a long enough episode that it doesn't need a lot of chatter at the start. But I do want to remind everyone to check out my new podcast, Crime Lines and Consequences. Our second episode will come out on Thursday, June 22nd, so that is the day after this episode will be in the main feed. And we greatly improved between episode 1 and 2, with having just the right sound and feel for what we're looking for. The episode is on the disappearance of Reeves Johnson. This is a cold case out of Maine that Kristen, the host of Murder, She Told, came on the show to tell us all about it. She got so involved in this case that she ended up working with the police on it. And not the police helping her with the podcast episode, which they did, but they actually had her help with the investigation. And you're going to hear way more about it tomorrow. So today, let's get into our Crime Lines episode. Thankfully, for the sake of having a lot of information to work with, the eventual trial in this case did air on Court TV, and it is still viewable online if watching trials is your thing. Let's get started with Lita McClinton. Lita was born in 1952 in Atlanta to a prominent family. Her father, Emery, was an official with the U.S. Department of Transportation, and her mother, Joanne, was a Georgia state representative. She and her siblings attended private schools, and the family was active in the Jack and Jill Club, which is formally known as Jack and Jill of America. It was founded in 1938 when upper-middle-class Black families decided that their children needed networking and social opportunities that they were being excluded from due to segregation. The group started in Philadelphia and eventually spread through other areas in the country, including Atlanta. After high school, Lita went to Spelman, which is a top historically Black college, and earned a bachelor's degree in political science. Lita could have done anything, and she had so many paths in front of her that she had the resources and the intelligence to pursue. But she decided to go for the thing she knew she loved and was passionate about and was good at, and that was fashion. Lita got a job at a high-end clothing boutique before becoming a buyer for Riches, which was an Atlanta-based department store, basically like a Macy's. So much like a Macy's, in fact, that Macy's eventually bought them out. One day, while Lita was actually still working at the boutique, she met a man named Jim Sullivan who came into the shop. Jim was Irish Catholic and from Boston, and he kind of looked like a Kennedy brother if you cocked your head to the side and squinted a bit. He definitely had that Kennedy-like accent, though it was a little rougher around the edges, as he had grown up working class. But he was smart and worked hard going to good schools before he moved to Georgia in 1973. He moved down there because his uncle, who had no children, asked Jim to help run his liquor distributor company called Macon Crown Beverages. Jim moved down there with his wife and 4 small children, but his wife filed for divorce just a couple of years later in March of 1975. When the divorce was final, she moved the kids back home to Boston. After Jim met Lita at the shop, he asked her out, and they were very soon dating seriously. Within a year, they were talking about marriage, but it was only after Jim proposed that he told Lita that he had been married before, and that he had 4 children. Some sources say he sprung this on her literally the day before the wedding. Lita had no idea, and the divorce part was going to take some time to get over because they were both Catholic, and divorce was a touchy subject. And of course, so were the 4 children that she didn't know he had. How do you date someone for several months and they never mention their children? Jim didn't have no contact with his kids, but he definitely didn't have them every other weekend because they were living all the way up in Boston. But Lita was in love and she wanted it to work, so she forgave Jim for not telling her sooner. But then Jim did something else. He handed her a prenup. Young and in love and with a wedding planned, she signed it without really thinking about it because she wasn't going into this marriage thinking that they would ever get divorced. They were going to be together forever, obviously, so the prenup would never really matter. This prenup was one-sided, and it would have left her with nothing more than she brought into the marriage, even if Jim increased his own personal wealth during the marriage. But even if Lita had really looked at the prenup closely, she may have still signed it because she did have her own generational wealth. She had a college degree and a work ethic. It's not as though Jim was so far out of her financial league at the time they got married. She had money before the marriage, and should the marriage end, she would have money after. Plus, while they were dating, Jim was generous, buying her expensive gifts like diamond jewelry. She wasn't really worried about that side of things. So in December of 1976, Jim and Lita married. Lita's parents celebrated with her in spite of their reservations. They weren't concerned for themselves that Jim was white, but they did think Lita was being a bit naive about what it would mean to be in an interracial couple in the South in the 1970s. They also didn't love the age difference, with Jim being 34 and Lita being just 24. And of course, we have the divorce, the 4 kids, and what they saw as Jim's absolutely unchecked ego. They certainly didn't see him as the complete package that Lita did, but if you want to be part of your adult child's life, you have to accept their autonomy. So they didn't love her decision, but they loved her, so they supported it. After the two married, Lita commuted the hour and a half between Jim's home in Macon and her job in Atlanta, but soon enough she quit the job to live full-time in Macon. When Jim's uncle died, Jim inherited both the property he lived on, which had a large home on it, and the business. At this point, Lita didn't have to work, so she instead focused on bringing her society life from Atlanta to Macon. She taught Jim how to dress more fashionably and helped him learn more about Southern hospitality and manners, things you absolutely need to be accepted into Southern society. But like her parents feared, Lita wasn't ready for the pushback against their interracial marriage. It's not that Lita was new to racism. She grew up upper middle class in an established and well-known family, but she was still a black woman in Georgia during the civil rights movement. She was one of the first black students admitted into her high school. So she had encountered racism before, but it was nothing like this. In Macon, what she experienced was more aggressive, with people throwing trash and watermelon rinds on their lawn after Lita moved in. I have a sizable international audience, so I'm not sure if everyone knows that in America, watermelon is tied to a racist trope. But when I thought about how I would explain that here, I realized that Even though I've known this was a racist trope for as long as I can remember, it didn't occur to me until now that I had absolutely no idea why. So I went and looked it up and found an interesting article from The Atlantic about it, which will be linked in my sources. Back as early as 1800, watermelon was already seen as a low-class, poor person's food. It was peasant food, and it was seen as a symbol of everything wrong with the people who eat it. It was easy to grow, messy to eat, and sweet like the food a child would eat. It symbolized laziness, uncleanliness, and immaturity and lack of sophistication. The trope began in Europe, and when it arrived in the United States, it was with its original intent, more looking down on socioeconomic status, not race. So the foundation was already there when, during the Civil War, emancipation happened and slavery was made illegal in the United States. Those who were now free had more control over their lives, and many went into farming themselves, often as sharecroppers, and they began growing watermelon. It became a symbol of freedom that was soon twisted and merged with the existing trope about people who would grow and eat watermelon. It was turned into proof that Black people were not ready for freedom because they lacked the sophistication to not eat watermelon. I mean, it seems so far removed from what we do today. However, this trope has continued. And 100 years after the Civil War, when Lita moved to Macon as a Black woman married to a white man, it's safe to say that those throwing the rinds on her lawn may not have known why it was a racist trope, but they definitely knew it was. And the message was clear: she was not welcome. But Lita wanted to stay and try to rise above it. She was going to prove herself in Macon, and she did so by joining philanthropic pursuits, working with the American Heart Association, and also working for a local scholarship pageant, where she helped coach the first Black winner of the Miss Macon title. As for Jim, he was a prominent businessman, and he sat on the board of the Macon Arts and Sciences Museum. People generally found him charming, unless they tried to do business with him. Then he was ambitious and cutthroat, but most people in Macon didn't know him in that context. By working in the community and with the community, Lita and Jim built a space for themselves to live peacefully as he grew the modestly successful business he inherited into a highly profitable one. Though the two had found some peace in town, the peace of their marriage was not going to last. In December of 1982, when Jim was out of town, Lita found a Christmas card written out to him and signed, quote, "Missing your kisses at Christmas." Suspecting he was having an affair, Lita went to the return address on the envelope, which was right there in Macon, and confronted the woman. She admitted that she and Jim had been having an affair. Heartbroken, Lita packed a bag and went to her parents' home in Atlanta, intending to file for divorce. Jim called her and denied the affair outright. He loved his wife and he wanted to reconcile. Lita heard him out, and who knows if she believed him or just wanted to believe him, but she was willing to accept that there had not been any cheating. And in a show of trust, Jim offered to sign a post-nuptial agreement that would override the prenup. Instead of getting nothing in the event of a divorce, Lita would get 3 annual lump sum payments of $30,000 plus $300 a week in alimony for that same span of time. Lita also used this separation time to talk to Jim about another issue in their marriage, and that was day-to-day finances. While Jim would spend untold money hosting fancy dinner parties for people he wanted to network with, and he would spend that money on his own clothes, he wanted Lita to spend pretty much nothing on food or clothing or personal items for herself. Jim was stingy on a good day, but on a bad day, when he would get mad at her, he'd cut her off from all of their money entirely. So Lita negotiated a budget that she would manage for household expenses, groceries, and her own clothing. Jim offered the low end, given his wealth, offering just $15,000 a year for all of these things. Lita said she needed more, but Jim said that he couldn't really afford it because he was cash poor. His money was tied up in the business. Lita accepted this, but what she didn't know was that Jim had other plans for his money. He was only in Macon because that's where the business was. Where he really wanted to be was among the wealthy of Palm Beach, Florida. Lita was against moving there, completely against it. But that didn't matter to Jim, and he bought his dream home in Palm Beach in 1983 without ever taking Lita there to see it. And that was on purpose. Jim was afraid that if the sellers found out he had a black wife, they would back out of the sale. What this tells me is that Jim fully expected Lita to experience racism in Palm Beach. But his dream to live there was more important to him than his wife's literal safety. Lita reluctantly moved to Florida with Jim, and she experienced exactly what he expected. She would answer the front door and would be asked if the lady of the house was in because they assumed she was the help. She was the only black person on the street who wasn't an employee of the homeowners. A neighbor who did socialize with the couple told the Atlanta Constitution that Lita was discriminated against and excluded. She said the attitude of the area was that it was okay if your gardener was black, but you wouldn't invite him over for cocktails. In a compromise, after having bought the house that Lita did not want to live in, Jim bought a 4-room luxury townhouse in his name only in Atlanta so that Lita could stay near her family whenever she wanted. There seemed to be some idea that they would both be able to live in each place part-time, but Jim only wanted to be in Palm Beach and Lita mostly wanted to stay in Atlanta. Now, in Palm Beach, they were invited to parties that neighbors hosted here and there, but they were never invited to join any exclusive clubs where you had to be sponsored by a friend who was already a member. Jim blamed this on Lita's skin color, but rather than direct his anger at the racists, he directed it at her. If not for Lita, he believed he would have really made something of himself in Palm Beach society. The truth was that Lita's race was definitely an issue, but so was Jim's rough manner and nouveau riche attitude. But he didn't see it as anything other than Lita's fault, and that meant his best path forward was to distance himself from his own wife. At a party once, he introduced Lita to someone by her first name, but never said, "This is my wife, Lita." He just said, "This is Lita." He was socially distancing himself from her right in front of her face. And soon enough, he started going out without her entirely, maybe hoping that his wife was out of sight, out of mind to Palm Beach high society. The out of sight, out of mind thing definitely worked for Jim, who was cheating on Lita pretty consistently again. She found out about it in the summer of 1985. So one day in August, when Jim was out of town, Lita packed up what she could fit into a U-Haul trailer and towed it up to Atlanta, where she moved into the townhouse full-time. She then filed for divorce in Georgia. Jim again tried to reconcile with her, and Lita said that, again, there would have to be a renegotiation of the financial terms of both their marriage and the post-nup. After all, between the time of the first post-nup and their separation this time, Jim had sold his uncle's business. And as the sole heir, he made $5 million. Plus, he was being paid a large monthly salary as part of his non-compete clause. He was basically being paid not to work in the industry. That is a huge change in fortune. So if Lita was going to take him back this time, she wanted some of the assets put in her name so she would have security in the marriage and so that he couldn't just cut her off. And she wanted an increased payout in the event of a divorce. Jim said, no way. He was the one who worked and she didn't, so he believed everything earned during the marriage was his. Never mind that he literally inherited an entire business that he didn't start or establish, and he only took it over after it was profitable. Jim was not so focused on what he had handed to him, he just didn't want to hand anything to anyone else, especially Lita. So instead of another settlement, they were headed in for an ugly divorce, just about as messy as you can imagine. Jim accused Lita of using drugs, claiming he found dollar bills with cocaine residue on them. Lita didn't use drugs, so she took monthly drug tests to prove it. Jim also accused her of stealing things from him, including 2 diamonds. Her attorneys demanded that Jim provide evidence of any of his claims in court, which he hadn't done. On Lita's side, she accused Jim of cheating on her and of committing financial abuse, which were things she did have proof of. Lita had a pretty big early win when it came to the divorce. She filed in Atlanta, and Jim tried to get it moved to Palm Beach, claiming that they were both Florida residents. Georgia is one of only 2 states that allow for a jury during divorce proceedings. Jim, as the white man in an interracial relationship, was much more interested in taking his chances with a judge in Palm Beach than a jury in Atlanta. But he lost his motion fighting jurisdiction. Jim also lost the fight over temporary alimony. Lita's marital allowance was about $1,200 a month, which was roughly what she would get in alimony according to the post-nuptial agreement. But instead, the judge had ordered Jim to pay the full alimony payment as calculated under Georgia law based on his income, and that ended up being $7,000 a month, 6 times what he thought he would have to pay. Jim would be held in contempt 3 times over about a year and a half for failure to pay. So Lita had gotten a few wins early on in the proceedings, but the biggest hurdle was ahead of them, the postnup. Lita wanted it thrown out, saying that she was coerced into signing it, and it was entered into with the understanding Jim would not cheat on her, which he then did. Jim, of course, wanted it enforced, especially since it was based on his financial situation from before he sold the business for millions of dollars. If the prenup was thrown out, he was likely looking at a divorce settlement that would have been closer to 50%. Though he was estimated to be worth $4 to $5 million at this point, the bulk of his wealth was tied up in properties, which included that Palm Beach home. That home he still owed $1 million on. He very well may have had to sell that dream house to settle any divorce judgment if he was ordered to give Lita half, or even close to half. A lot was riding on that post-nuptial agreement and if it would hold up in court. Jim was not willing to talk about any sort of private settlement until he found out if he could get away with the bare minimum. As this divorce dragged on, Lita and Jim were racking up their legal bills. Jim refused to speak to her except through attorneys, which, while good for their personal peace, ran up the attorneys' fees they were both paying. And while all of this was going on, they were both getting on with their lives in other aspects. Lita had reconnected with her Atlanta friends and the social scene there. She was organizing charity functions and living in the townhome. Jim had finally started to be accepted into society in Palm Beach, not because he was separated from Lita, but because he got a position in the city. He helped campaign for Dee Dee Merrickx, who was a very popular mayor, in her 1985 re-election campaign. After she was re-elected, she didn't forget who helped get her there, and she recommended Jim Sullivan for a spot on the Landmarks Preservation Commission. This is a very important position in Palm Beach. Before people can renovate their older properties, they need the approval of the commission. Jim wasn't put on the board just because he was friends with the mayor. He had fixed up his own place very tastefully, and in line with what the city wanted, so he seemed to be a good fit. Because he had the power to approve or reject renovation plans, he was very popular among those who could not only afford to buy one of these historic homes in Palm Beach, but also renovate it. It always helped to have a friend or two on the board, so Jim's social status was immediately elevated thanks to this new perceived power. He also soon had a new girlfriend named Suki. Suki had entered the Palm Beach social scene through her wealthy husband, Leonard, who was 23 years older than her. But in 1986, Leonard hired a PI to follow his pretty young wife because he suspected she was cheating, and he learned that she was. She was cheating with Jim Sullivan, who was one of his friends. He divorced Suki and she moved in with Jim into his 18-room mansion. Suki had already found acceptance in Palm Beach society, and even with the quiet scandal of how they got together, this helped open even more doors for Jim. And soon his divorce from Lita would be finalized. They finally had a trial date coming up in late January 1987. It had been a year and a half since Lita and her U-Haul left Palm Beach. But 10 days before the scheduled trial, on Friday, January 16, 1987, they had a hearing that would deal with a motion about the division of property. Center stage was that post-nup, and the decision over whether or not Lita could challenge it at the divorce trial was a pivotal decision to both of their cases. Lita had a lot on her mind the night before this hearing, not just because of the hearing, but also because Jim seemed to be playing a game. He had demanded Lita allow a photographer in to document all of the assets in the Atlanta townhouse. They finally got that scheduled for the week of the hearing, the day before, in fact, but then Lita got a call at the last minute that Jim canceled it. The photographer said he got a call from Jim's attorneys, and he asked them why they were canceling after Jim was so insistent it needed to be done before the hearing, and they said they weren't sure. They were just told by their client to cancel this appointment. So when you're in a contentious situation with someone and they do something last minute that doesn't make sense, it's pretty normal to be suspicious. On top of that, the day after the hearing, the 17th, Lita was throwing a party. She had organized a large charity function for New Year's Eve to raise funds for cystic fibrosis research. She wanted to express her gratitude to those who helped with a little post-event party. So, on the night of January 15th, she invited her college friend Poppy over, and Poppy brought her toddler daughter with her. Lita and Poppy had something in common at this moment. They were both going through messy divorces, and they were leaning on each other as needed. Poppy and Lita spent the first part of the evening chatting with another friend, and then when he left, Poppy and Lita planned to stay up talking, but they were tired, so they both fell asleep in front of the TV. The next morning, Poppy got up to get ready for the day, and she went into Lita's room to ask if she could borrow a dress for a work event she had. Lita was still in bed and told Poppy to go ahead. Poppy took the dress and then went to take a shower. As she got out of the shower and started getting dressed, she heard the doorbell ring. She had gone to the door of the guest room and heard Lita get up. Lita came out into the hallway with a robe on and said she would get the door. Poppy heard her go downstairs, unlock and open the door, and say, "Good morning." There was a little time that passed that was enough for a short conversation, and then Poppy heard 2 to 3 shots. At the sounds of the gunfire, Poppy shut the bedroom door, locked it, and grabbed her daughter, who was just 2 years old. She took her through the bathroom into a closet and put her daughter on the ground before covering her with a blanket. She told her to be quiet. Poppy had no idea if the shooter was coming into the house, possibly to rob it, so her entire focus was on protecting her daughter. She went back out through the bathroom into the guest room and made sure the door was locked. She put her ear to the door, but she didn't hear anything. She still wasn't sure if someone was in the house, so she stayed up there hiding with her daughter until she heard police radios. When she knew the police were there, Poppy came out of the room and looked down the stairs towards the entryway and saw Lita's feet. She asked the police if Lita was alive, and they said barely. Poppy stayed upstairs with her daughter and called Lita's mother to let her know that Lita had been shot, and her family raced towards the townhouse. They arrived as Lita was being loaded into the ambulance. Lita was pronounced dead at the hospital at the age of 35, having been killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. Some coverage of this case, particularly in those shorter documentary-style shows, leave out the fact that Poppy's daughter was there. So it comes across as cowardly that she hid and left her friend abandoned, injured, and bleeding on the floor. But when you learn her toddler was there, it makes sense that her first priority was to protect her daughter more than her friend. I really wish these shows didn't leave that out because, to me, it's a huge piece of context. Though Poppy saw little of what happened as she was upstairs trying to keep her daughter safe, the person who called 911 had actually witnessed a lot. Bob was Lita's next-door neighbor, and his front door was just about 30 feet from hers since these are attached homes. Bob was taking out the trash through his garage and around to the gate on the side of his house. As he headed out of the garage, he saw a man standing on Lita's porch. When he came back around to go back through the garage after dropping off the trash, he saw that the man had stepped back from the porch and was looking up at the house. Bob got a good look at the man, and they locked eyes, and the guy was carrying a long box with a bow on it. As Bob walked back into his garage, he thought he heard Lita call to the guy, but he couldn't make out the words. The man then walked towards Lita's front door. Bob was in his garage, leaning against his car, flipping through the paper. He said he was in there for about 10 to 15 seconds before he heard shots fired, and he immediately connected the shooting to the man on Lita's porch. To get out of the neighborhood, Bob knew the man would have to pass back by his house, and the man knew Bob had seen him. Worried that he was the next target as an eyewitness, Bob ran out to his backyard and hid behind the gate until he saw the man run by. The shooter ran so fast, he almost fell over. Once he was gone, Bob ran over to Lita's house. He saw the door open about 6 inches, and he was nervous to look in because he knew what he was going to find. He saw Lita lying there, so he first checked on her, then he ran to the phone to call 911, and then he went back to Lita to comfort her while they waited on help. Because Bob saw the man, he was able to give a good description. This man was about 6 feet tall, he was balding, he was between 45 and 50 years old, and about 180 pounds. He was carrying that box, which was found at the scene. Inside was a dozen pink roses, and there was a bullet hole through the box. It looked like the man had used the flowers to get Lita to open the door, and after handing them to her, he pulled out a gun. There was a stray shot that went through the living room, and then it appears that Lita must have instinctively raised the box to her face and turned her head to shield herself when he fired again. A 9mm shell casing was found outside the door. The police had hoped to get some information by figuring out where the flowers came from. Unfortunately, it didn't have a florist mark on the box, so they had to call around to see if anyone bought a dozen pink roses recently. They got a hit with a shop just half a mile from Lita's home. The clerk clearly remembered the man who bought these flowers because he made him nervous. The man was acting oddly, and there was another man in a car waiting on him. Afraid he was being set up for a robbery, the florist tried to just get that customer out the door as fast as possible. He said he was so nervous that he didn't even wire together all of the roses. He finished 5 and then just put the rest in the box. And that confirmed to the police that this was the right sale because that is how they were found at the scene. The customer specifically told the florist not to put the store sticker on the box, so he just wrapped it with a ribbon. The man got into a white Toyota with the other man driving, and they took off. Neither of these men completely matched the description of the shooter, but the flowers did connect them. So the police developed 3 composite sketches. The shooter, as described to them by Bob the neighbor, the man who bought the flowers, and the one who waited in the car, as described by the florist. Now, this murder had all the hallmarks of a hit, and a big part of that was that the shooter made no attempt to disguise himself any step of the way. He was not worried that Lita would recognize him, and he wasn't worried that her neighbor Bob got a good look at him and would be able to describe him to the police. He knew he wasn't someone who could ever be connected directly to Lita. Knowing this, it's no surprise the police immediately started looking at the estranged husband who was afraid of losing half of his fortune in a divorce. But when the police spoke to Jim that first day, he had another theory. He said this might be a drug hit as Lita was using drugs. And I want to be clear that no matter how many times Jim is trying to sell this story of drug use, it was a lie each time. Lita was not using drugs, and she proved it repeatedly through that drug testing. In Palm Beach, word of Lita's murder was spreading, but for the most part, no one suspected Jim would have been involved. That wasn't the case in Atlanta, though. Bob, Lita's neighbor, went to work the day of the murder and pulled a record of a phone call that he had had with Jim Sullivan just days before the murder. Jim knew Bob in Bob's official capacity as an attorney, but their professional relationship had ended a few years before. On the morning of January 13th, Jim called Bob at the office early and left a message. Bob called him back around 10:30 when he had a free minute. All calls in and out of the office were logged because this was a law firm and they needed to know who to bill for the time. So Bob pulled the records because he wanted to be sure he had the details right before he went to the police about this call, which he did. According to what Bob remembered, Jim had called asking about any suspicious activity around Lita's home and if he had seen a green car parked out front. Bob said he hadn't noticed anything, and at the time, he assumed Jim was trying to dig up information on what Lita was doing for the sake of the divorce. But when Lita was killed 3 days later, he immediately thought about this phone call from Jim. It had come out of nowhere. They hadn't spoken on the phone in a long time. So what suspicious thing had Jim been wondering about? And it turned out Bob wasn't the only one Jim called that same morning. The other person was named Marvin, and he happened to be Poppy's estranged husband. So let's back up a bit. 5 months before the murder, Marvin pleaded guilty to illegally tapping Poppy's phone. Lita and Poppy had found the device and went to the police, which then led to the criminal charges. Marvin had sent the tapes he had from those phone calls to Jim at Jim's request, since some of the conversations had to do with Jim and Lita's divorce. He told Jim to go ahead, listen to them, take all the notes he wanted, but then send the tapes back. Of the 40 tapes he sent, Marvin only got back 35. He was upset with Jim about keeping those other 5 tapes, and he cut off all contact. And really, the truth was they were only friends because their wives were friends, and now that both of their marriages were ending, Marvin really had no interest in Jim Sullivan. So Marvin was surprised when Jim called him out of the blue the same day he called Bob. He left a message around 7 a.m. and told him he needed to speak with him urgently. When Marvin called Jim back, Jim seemed anxious, and Marvin believed it was about the upcoming divorce hearing. He started asking questions about Lita, like was she still living in the townhouse, if anyone was living with her, and if she was still driving the same car. Marvin assumed these questions were because Jim was looking to hire a private investigator to watch her. Marvin told the police all of this information, but they were suspicious of Marvin. Given that he and his wife were divorcing and she was at Lita's house at the time of the murder, and Jim was calling Marvin a few days before, it all seemed a little coincidental. Marvin denied all involvement in Lita's murder, and he tried to distance himself from Jim Sullivan even more than he already had. So, Jim calling two people in Atlanta about Lita on January 13th stood out to the police because of something else they had heard. A friend of Lita's told the investigators that someone knocked on Lita's door that morning around 6:30. Lita didn't answer it because she wasn't answering the door to a stranger at 6:30 in the morning. She told her friend about it, though, saying that she thought it might be a process server with a subpoena somehow related to the divorce. So the same morning that a strange man knocked on Lita's door, Jim was calling people to confirm where she lived and if they saw anything strange. But that's not all. The investigation also uncovered that Jim talked to someone else that morning. 3 men had checked into a motel near Lita's home. Phone records showed that 3 calls from their room went to Jim's house in Palm Beach around 7:45 in the morning. Then, a bit after 10:30, after Jim had talked to Bob, he called the motel room back. The room was registered to someone named Johnny Furr, which was assumed to be an alias when they couldn't find anyone with that name. Additional phone records from Jim's house gathered in February of 1987, less than a month after the murder, showed that 40 minutes after Lita was shot at 9 a.m., Jim accepted a collect call. It was from a rest stop 34 miles north of Lita's house, and the call lasted under a minute. It would take about 40 minutes to make it from Lita's home to that rest stop, so what were the odds that this call was about something other than her murder? And then they had even more phone evidence that came from another person. The police hadn't tapped Jim's phone, but they had a tap on the phone of someone Jim knew, but it was tapped for another reason. But on that recorded call, Jim was heard talking about the murder, and he mentioned that Lita was killed with a 9mm automatic pistol. This information was accurate, but there was no way Jim could have known it. The weapon used was purposeful holdback information. It had never been released. So the police have their suspect, and they had a theory of the crime. They believed that Jim hired 3 men to kill Lita, and they first tried on January 13th. But she didn't open the door, leading Jim to make phone calls trying to figure out if she was still living there and what was going on. Confirming that she was still living there and she was living alone, they came up with another plan. Knowing that a flower delivery man wouldn't raise any eyebrows, they bought the flowers and tried again. And this time, it worked. Lita opened the door. After killing Lita and making it out of the city, they pulled over and called Jim to let him know the job was done. Jim then acted surprised when his attorney called and said he didn't need to come to Atlanta for the hearing because Lita had been killed. The problem was that no matter how much sense this theory made, and it sure made a lot of sense, there was no direct evidence. Though they officially named Jim Sullivan as their prime suspect, the police didn't arrest him. They needed more, preferably the name of the person who did shoot Lita. Jim, for his part, denied any involvement. But now that he was a widower, he quickly moved to secure the townhouse. He changed the locks and resisted letting Lita's family in to even retrieve her personal effects. And then he married his girlfriend, Suki. Jim continued to live in Palm Beach, a free man, when in May of 1990, he got into a fender bender. Now, this wouldn't be a big deal for most people, but Jim had accumulated so many traffic violations that his license had been suspended the year before. So he was driving without a license and he was issued a ticket. When it was time to pay the ticket, Jim opted to fight it in court. He had Suki come into court with him and testify under oath that she had been the one driving at the time of the fender bender, not Jim. And this was all a big misunderstanding. The judge accepted the testimony and dismissed the charge against Jim. The officer who issued the ticket heard about this and went to the judge. He said that Jim was lying and Suki couldn't have been driving because she wasn't even there. And the witnesses at the scene could testify to that. The judge opted not just to reissue the ticket to Jim, but to charge Jim and Suki with perjury. So instead of just paying the ticket, Jim ended up with a year of house arrest. While Jim was on house arrest, a tip came in related to Lita's murder. An informant named Johnny claimed that back in April of 1987, he was on a road trip with a man named Tom. Tom started bragging about how he had a lot of money thanks to a murder-for-hire plot that he was a part of. Tom said the target was a black woman living in Atlanta, and her husband who hired them was a white millionaire living in Florida. Johnny also implicated Poppy's ex-husband Marvin in this deal. Now, the police were so sure that Marvin knew something at this point that they offered him immunity to talk, but he said he couldn't help because he truly knew nothing about the murder. Tom, the man Johnny named, was arrested, but the charges were soon dropped because there was absolutely no evidence besides Johnny's statement. And the reason there was no evidence was because, as it would turn out, Tom didn't do it. But I bring up this incident because something else happened that was triggered by this tip, and that is federal agents executed a search warrant on Jim Sullivan's home. There, they found 4 unregistered guns, including a sawed-off shotgun. So Jim was charged with a felony weapons charge and ended up with more house arrest plus some time in county jail. And that trip to county jail wasn't a fun one. Jim ended up getting in a physical fight and had his nose broken. But I'm not even bringing this up because of the weapons that were found, because they weren't the only thing found. They also found Jim's diaries from 1986 and 1987. Jim was a note taker, so he didn't just use his planner to keep track of upcoming events and to-do lists. He also used it to just jot down thoughts and memories. On December 12th, 1986, a month before the murder, Jim just wrote down the word pistol. On January 14th, 1987, the day after the mystery man knocked on Lita's door and 2 days before the murder, he wrote, "Get flowers." Then on January 16th, the day of the murder, Jim wrote, quote, "Suki and I celebrated with champagne and caviar." He literally wrote down that he celebrated Lita's death, giving a clue as to how deeply he hated her. These were more pieces to the puzzle and more evidence, but still, it was not enough to charge Jim. And then Suki filed for divorce, and she claimed that she was terrified of Jim because of what happened to Lita. According to Suki, one day in 1990 when Jim was on house arrest, he turned up the TV loud, worried that the police had listening devices in their home. He confessed to her that he hired someone to kill Lita and suggested that they sell the house and move wherever they wanted in the world, somewhere outside the reach of the U.S. government. Now that Suki was the one divorcing Jim and putting his money at risk, she felt she had a target on her. So with all of this evidence, especially Suki's testimony, Jim was arrested and charged in January of 1992 with using interstate commerce to commit a crime. These were federal charges, and he was facing 4 counts, 3 for the calls between the hotel in Georgia and his home in Palm Beach that happened 3 days before the murder, and then the 4th charge was for the collect call to his home 40 minutes after the murder. These charges weren't really for the murder of Lita, but rather using interstate phone lines to arrange for the murder. The government only had 5 years from the time the crime was committed to charge for it, so they basically said now or never and chose now, arresting him just days before the statute of limitations expired. Suki was the star witness when this did go to trial in November 1992, and the defense painted her as a gold digger who was trying to send her estranged husband to prison so she could get more out of the divorce. But the real issue with the government's case was that they proved the calls happened, and they proved they happened at suspicious points in the timeline, but they couldn't prove the content of the calls. After the prosecution was done presenting their case, the defense filed a motion for a directed verdict. That essentially was asking the judge to find that the government's case didn't meet the bare minimum burden of proof and to dismiss it. These are often asked for, so much that I don't even mention it in my episodes. And that's because they are rarely granted. But in this case, it was. The judge did express reluctance in dismissing the charges, but said the government just had not met the burden of proof as to the purpose or content of those phone calls. So Jim was set free, but things had really changed for him in Palm Beach. Suki's accusations against him, his arrest for the weapons charge, and the details that came out at the federal trial turned Palm Beach society against him. And he had hired 2 top defense attorneys for that case, which drained him financially. Jim sold his dream mansion and moved to a more modest home about 30 minutes away. But his legal issues were not over just yet. Lita's family, ready to get justice in whatever court would give it to them, sued Jim for wrongful death. A few days before their 1994 trial, Jim fired his attorney and went pro se. And he lost. Big. He was ordered to pay Lita's family $4 million. A year later, he won an appeal arguing that they sued outside of the statute of limitations, which was true. But the family appealed to the Florida Supreme Court, saying that the only reason they were outside of the statute of limitations was because Jim had covered his tracks well, and it took longer for the evidence to be apparent. They won, and the verdict was reinstated in 1997. The back and forth in court with the wrongful death suit did something more important than get a judgment for the family. It got national news coverage, and the TV show Extra aired a segment on Lita's murder, and from this segment, a tip was called in 1998. A woman named Belinda, who was living in Texas, said that she knew who killed Lita, and she knew who hired him. The hitman was her ex-boyfriend, and she recognized the man who hired him on TV. It was Jim Sullivan. Belinda had been holding on to the story for over 10 years. It goes back to 1986 when Belinda was dating a man named Tony Harwood and living in North Carolina. Tony worked as a contractor for a moving company, and he had delivered furniture to Jim Sullivan's home in Palm Beach in November of 1986. When Tony was back home in North Carolina, he told Belinda that a man he had moved stuff for offered him money to kill his wife, who he was having issues with. Belinda blew him off, thinking he was just telling a tall tale. A couple of months later, in January of 1987, Tony went back south to Atlanta for what she thought was work, and he came home to tell her that he went there to kill the woman, but she wouldn't open the door. Belinda still didn't believe him and told him in a joking manner that you can't get a woman to open the door unless you bring flowers. A few days later, Tony left again and came back saying he did it. He completed the job. And Belinda basically told him straight out that she didn't believe him, and it was time to just be done telling this story. But Tony insisted it was true. One night he told her to get in the car, and they drove down to a truck stop in Florida. They sat at a booth when a man, who Belinda said was Jim Sullivan, showed up. He put a folded newspaper on the table, and Tony picked it up. In the newspaper was an envelope, and inside the envelope was cash, half of the payment to kill Lita. Realizing the person she was with was a dangerous man, Belinda started preparing to leave him. And when she finally did, moving all the way to another state, she armed herself with a gun. If Tony and Jim would kill Lita, surely they would kill someone who knew too much. Tony had threatened her to keep quiet, and scared, she tried to just move on with her life. But then she saw the segment on TV and realized that this man was getting away with murder. The family was left without justice, and she knew that she had the pieces to fix that. She worked for an attorney at the time, so she went to him, and together they came forward with her story. And this is why nationwide coverage for cold cases is so important. Someone may not feel safe coming forward when they're still living in their hometown or near the killer, but when they get free of them and at a safe distance years later, they can be moved to call in a tip. After Belinda's tip, the police found Tony Harwood, who very soon after confessed. Tony said he met Jim doing a moving job, and his guys had accidentally scratched a tile while moving a piano. Jim was irate, so Tony stepped in to stop Jim from laying into his employees. He got Jim the paperwork to fill out the report on the damaged tile, which Jim would be compensated for from the parent company. While they were working on that, Jim mentioned that his wife was about to take him for all he had, and he was curious if Tony knew anyone who could take care of the problem for him. Tony knew what this meant, and he said he probably knew someone, but it wouldn't be cheap. It would be $25,000 with half up front. Jim then drew a map to get to Lita's townhouse, and Tony took it with him home. This taking of the map sent a clear message to Jim that Tony was on board, but Tony claimed that he hadn't really thought much about it, assuming he would never hear from Jim again. But then, right before Christmas, 2 certified checks showed up in the mail. Jim must have gotten Tony's address from the damage claim form. Tony wasn't sure what to do. He figured he could just keep the money, since what was Jim going to do about it? Go to the police over a breach of contract for a murder plot? So he decided to go ahead and put the money in the bank. Not long after the money showed up, Tony spoke with Jim on the phone, though by this point he couldn't remember who called who first. Jim said he wanted the murder to happen very quickly before Christmas. Tony didn't really want to go through with it, so he put it off, thinking about how he could get out of this. But then he figured that if this guy was willing to have his wife killed, he would definitely have Tony killed, and so he came to the decision to keep the money and go through with it. With what comes next, Tony's story has changed a bit over the years, particularly about who exactly was involved and what they did. But the basics are that on January 13th, 1987, Tony and 2 friends drove to Atlanta. One of them knocked on Lita's door that morning, got no answer, and then they all checked into the local motel where they talked to Jim. They stayed there for a short period before they left and went back to North Carolina. When Tony talked to Jim, Jim told him he needed to try again. Belinda said the idea for flowers came from her, but Tony remembered it was actually Jim who mentioned it. But regardless, Jim was adamant that Lita had to be killed before the court hearing. Tony and at least one of his friends at this point, possibly 2, went back to Atlanta on January 15th and spent the night. The next morning, they stopped at the flower shop, where Tony says that his friend John went to buy the roses while Tony stayed in the car. They then drove to Lita's neighborhood, and one of them went up to the door, shot Lita, and ran off. The 2 drove north until they were clear of the city, then they pulled over and Tony called Jim collect. He said Merry Christmas, which was their sign that Lita had been killed. So, as far as these other people Tony implicated in the murder plot and later claimed one of the other ones was the actual shooter, he couldn't actually lead police to any of them. He said he only knew John as John the barber, though sometimes it's reported as John the bartender. This person who Tony said was the actual shooter was never found. Not everyone believed Tony when he claimed that he was not the shooter, but rather the middleman. But I think it's possible, however, even if he didn't shoot Lita himself, he set it up and he's no less guilty for it. Tony was offered a deal: testify against Jim Sullivan, and he could plead out on voluntary manslaughter. Tony took the deal and said he would testify against Jim if they could ever find him. Jim had done what Suki said he suggested they do. He left the country. It seems likely he left to avoid any garnishment for the wrongful death judgment against him, of which he paid $0. He was living in Costa Rica by the time Tony Harwood was arrested. When Jim was charged, the state reached out to his attorney to see if Jim would come back to Georgia voluntarily, and they said yes, he would. He would be turning himself in. But he didn't. Instead, he fled Costa Rica. The authorities were able to track him south to Panama and Venezuela, and then he vanished. There was a chance he went to Ireland because Jim, due to his parentage, had dual citizenship and an Irish passport. But over the years, based on the investigation, they believed he had gone to Asia. Jim made it to the top of the FBI's Most Wanted list when America's Most Wanted ran a segment. That segment was shown in Thailand in early 2002, and someone there recognized him. Jim Sullivan, now age 60, was arrested. His attorney claimed that Jim looked forward to coming back to the U.S. to clear up the charges against him. They said he actually wasn't aware of the charges until his arrest. He just so happened to leave Costa Rica as Tony Harwood was confessing. But Jim's actions after his arrest did not show an eagerness to return to the United States. Instead, he fought extradition for 2 years. His first argument was that he was an Irish citizen and Ireland opposes extradition of any Irish citizen to any country with the death penalty. The Thai courts did not find this compelling. So he appealed the order of extradition by saying it was double jeopardy since he was already tried on the federal charges related to the murder, so he couldn't be tried again. But this didn't go too far because in the U.S., double jeopardy doesn't apply to different jurisdictions. It really does not come up often, but a famous example of this is the case of the Eastburn family. A man named Tim Hennis was acquitted of killing Katie, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn in state court. Later, when DNA linked him to the crime, he was tried by the military court, since they also had jurisdiction. So that applies here. The feds charged him the first time, not the state. And now the state of Georgia was charging him. So again, the courts denied this, and in March 2004, Jim was extradited to the United States. The trial then occurred in March of 2006, nearly 20 years after the murder. And Jim was claiming innocence. The prosecution presented the motive you can guess, which was money. Obviously, the divorce was an issue, but there turned out to be a reason Jim initially told Tony he wanted Lita killed by Christmas of 1986. When Jim had bought that dream home, he had 2 mortgages held by the joint owners he bought the house from. He had until the end of 1986 to pay them off either in cash or by getting a loan. This type of balloon payment where there's a short-term owner-financed mortgage is not uncommon, and the amount Jim needed was about $1 million. He knew he could qualify for a loan for this money, and he applied for it. Except he wrote that he was single when the bank knew otherwise. They denied it, saying that he either needed to get Lita's consent or wait until the divorce was final to apply for the loan. So Jim was about to default on a very large loan thanks to Lita. The divorce wasn't even done and she was already costing him money. Within a week of her death, Jim called the bank and said to go forward with the loan since he was now single. Belinda and Tony both testified against Jim, and Tony's testimony varied from what he originally told the police. He still implicated Jim in orchestrating the murder for hire plot, but this is when he really started insisting that he was not the actual shooter, but the mysterious John was. The defense was that Jim didn't do it, and the witnesses against him, especially Tony and Belinda, were lying. The jury didn't believe him. They convicted him of malice murder, felony murder, burglary, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Though Jim was facing the death penalty, his life was spared and he was given a life without parole, and he is still incarcerated in a Georgia prison at the age of 82. Tony Harwood was released in 2018 after 20 years behind bars. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.